We're very happy that we have Sadanand Menon and Anita Cherian with us today to reflect on the state of art institutions in this country. But I would like to mention a special connection that LILA has with Sadanand. In a way, with the LILA's gets its organizational name, we call our foundation a foundation for Translocal Initiatives. This name has come to us because of him. So I would just like to mention how this came about. Like, this was a year back, more than a year back. Before LILA was born, it was a very casual kind of exchange between Sadanand and me, where he was looking at one of my papers on education, where I had used this word local, and he changed it into translocal. In fact, suggested and said, like, the things that you're looking at in this paper, translocal is a term that would be apt to use. And since then, this term has stayed with me, and it has become a kind of major site of thought, reflection. And when I was registering this LILA as a trust, I had no doubt that I wanted to call it a Foundation for Translocal Initiatives because of the tentativeness embedded in this concept, and also because of the continuity and connection that's possible within the frame of translocality. So this is a moment of acknowledgement and deep appreciation for his engagement. And thank you, Sadanand, for that moment of sharing. Today we have Anita with us. It's very significant that Anita is introducing Sadanand. If you've been regulars at these lectures, you would know that the chairs and the chairs are actually suggested by the speakers themselves, because we want to facilitate that space of exchange where there's a kind of organic, meaningful communication happening. So Sadanand had suggested Anita because her areas of research are kind of very directly connected to the topic that we are discussing today. I briefly introduce Anita, and then she can take it forward. Anita is a teacher at Indraprastha College for Women at University of Delhi, and in the past she was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and teacher of media studies at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai, where Sadanand is also teaching. Her research interests are in the areas of cultural policy and cultural studies, theatre history, performance studies, and cultural labor under the regimes of neoliberalism. At present, she is finishing up a manuscript on the institutional production of a national theatre in the years following independence. She has also begun work on a new project that examines cultural policy making in the time of globalization. So now you know how integrally linked her areas are, of research are with the topic that we are going to discuss. Over to you.
Thank you, Rizio, and thank you, LILA, for inviting me to chair this session. I am most honored to be here, and I'm most honored to chair this session with Sadanand speaking. Rizio had spoken about sharing and Sadanand's extraordinary capacity to share what he knows, and to share his experiences, and to share them in an absolutely meaningful, insightful, transformative way. Rizio had told me to kind of do this in an informal way, and I just want to kind of mark my long friendship with Sadanand. I met him a couple of decades ago, and I was directed to him by Rustam Barucha, who told me, if you're working in this area, you need to speak to Sadanand. And Rustam also told me about something that foolishly I did not know much about, which was Sadanand's extraordinary contribution in terms of the culture pages or the arts pages that he had created in the Economic Times in the 90s, in the early 90s. Those pages were an amazing resource because every week they documented, commented, critiqued on arts practice in the country. Mysteriously, those pages were removed after a few years. Those mysteries always need to be investigated, but that resource is something that we should all think of as a history of possibility. Sadanand Menon, it is my great pleasure to introduce him. He is an old friend, a one-time colleague, a generous mentor, a rigorous critic, and a rock star public intellectual. When you meet Sadanand, and when you've met him once, you've met him twice, you come in contact with this extraordinary warmth of his presence and that wonderful hug which gives you a sense that life has hope, life has possibility. And this, of course, comes alongside an absolutely wicked sense of humor. Those of you who've read his reviews of popular films in the pages of the Outlook will know that you cannot watch that film without thinking about what Sadanand has done to that film. It's a massacre with wit or by wit. He is, Rizio spoke about sharing. I went to him when I first began my work, and I went to him 3 months ago, just as I was thinking about how to wrap it up. And he's here today, and my work is still not complete. And he just said, "Bahut danda lagaya hai isko." And he has, of course, applied the stick several times, and he will continue to. He is a sounding board, a provider of ideas, is a provider of sources, insight, direction, encouragement. He has been a formulator of policy at the same time that he has been a cultural watchdog. He has been on more committees than it is possible to imagine. So he knows exactly what is happening in terms of how the arts function in this country, what is going to happen to them, the way in which institutions have developed. If anybody is doing research in these fields, Sadanand is the person that you need to go to. He has been an extraordinary collaborator with great artists, and this is a skill that comes from a kind of insight, from transparency, from openness. And he's worked, as we all know, with Chandralekha, with Dashrath Patel, with Bhupen Khakkar, with Cartier-Bresson, with Pina Bausch. His writings about them, about all these people, show an extraordinary familiarity, an extraordinary insight that comes from having lived alongside them. He is an archivist and a curator. I was looking up some material on the net today, and he had these two wonderful obituaries, one of which to Gangubai Hangal. And he talks about her as a university, a university of repertoire. And there is a great sense of sorrow that these universities of repertoire can just die out the way they are dying. Universities of I am in one of these universities that is, fast. Anyway, you read Sadanand, you think, okay, this is intelligence, this is humor, this is insight, this is being there, and this is somebody whose presence we need in some way to emulate. His work, his obituaries are something, I always read his obituaries because he is able to approach and enter the work of the artist we have lost. At the same time, he mourns their loss, but I think he mourns something else far more severely, and that is our relentless ignorance of how important the arts are to the polity. He is now a steward of culture with Spaces, which is the wonderful art space that he has created in Besant Nagar, where I first met him. Every time I go there, I cannot, I think it is more beautiful. And more beautiful, more alive. And the artists who work in Spaces remember Chandra every time they move there. And he is also an archivist. And an archivist asking us to approach the archive. And today, we are most grateful that he is here, and I look forward to this talk, as I am sure you do.
Thank you, first of all, for having created this wonderful forum where one notices meeting after meeting, the dialogue seems to be really linking up and emerging in some sort of a very interesting ongoing discourse. And your wonderful associates, Sachin, Amit, I think you're doing a great job. Thank you very much. It's actually, just as I entered this room, I thought about it when I saw the names. It's very, very peculiar, it's very ironical that to talk about the state of art institutions in India, we have a kind of a ganging up of three Mallus from way down south in Kerala. So she's a Mallu, he is a Mallu, and obviously I think such reflection is probably possible only from the margins. You really can't be at the center and be thinking about it. There's something to it. And probably this discourse needs to travel a little more outward into the margins. I just came this afternoon to Delhi from Ahmedabad, where we're creating a small little exhibition to mark the anniversary of my dear colleague Dashrath Patel, who passed away 2-3 years ago on December 1, and they have an exhibition of his line drawings, about 30,000-40,000 line drawings, of which we are selecting about 300-400 and presenting it. So the exhibition is happening at the Lalit Kala Academy, very small little lovely gallery they have downstairs, a good building, Gujarat Lalit Kala Academy. And again, a state institution. So the ongoing exhibition there is a exhibition supported and sponsored by the Central Ministry of Tribal Affairs. And I think it's called, the exhibition that's going on is called Adi Kala, the work of the Kala of the Adivasis. So there are about 55-60 works displayed there. 4 different tribes. There are the Gonds, there are the Rathwas, there are the Sauras, and so on. And on the walls they have displayed this, and there are some material prints for sale and so on. And they have 2 officials from Delhi who are section officers in the ministry who sit there every day, morning till evening, to look after the exhibition and meet people and talk to them. So since our exhibition is going to happen in the same place, I had to go in there a couple of times to do some measurements and that. Got chatting with them, and I heard one of these officials explain to a guest who had come in, who was asking a question about what kind of work is this. He said, ये लोग आदिवासी हैं और जंगल में रहते हैं. So this was the kind of deft definition of who an Adivasi in India is. So then I got a little provoked. So I didn't want to, of course, engage in a verbal duel with him. So I just went up to him and I said, look, what is on the walls is probably the work of some of the finest artists in the country. Who are unschooled, they have not been sent to any art school, they haven't gone to universities, they have picked it up in a so-called traditional way, and there's a certain continuity there, there's a certain sense of renewing what they have learned from their own lineage and so on. But the DNA is very clear. You see a Vaughan painting, the DNA of the Vaughan painting is extremely clear. So isn't it, instead of saying Adivasi hain, jungle mein rehte hain, etc., etc., can't you explain to a newcomer who doesn't know anything about this, can't you just say, these are national treasures? What prevents you from saying it? Well, they're fabulous works of art. So what, they're priced at 20,000 and 30,000, whereas modern Indian artists will be priced at 20 lakhs and 30 lakhs, but that's hardly the point. The work is an outstanding example of the kind of creative work that's happening from Indian soil. So there was a kind of embarrassed silence. Both these two guys were there, and they kind of looked at each other, they looked down. Then blurted out, "Sir, आदिवासी ही उनकी पहचान है, उनको national कैसे कह सकते हैं?" So example number one of what our arts are, what the state of our arts are, what the state of our art institutions are, the state of the personnel manning all these institutions are, and the kind of strange complex corner that we seem to have painted ourselves into, where we keep hearing these stories more and more, and you don't know whether to laugh or cry anymore, because it's reached that point of the macabre where it hurts, it really hurts. Now, I'm personally in a peculiar position at the moment, because right since the time I can remember from my early university days, I've been kind of pathologically tackling against the idea of institutionalization, any form of institutionalization. Those days it began with battling the idea of education and university system and so on, and it's now extended to other things. And one has always seen the institution as a sure sign of the disciplinary impulse of the state, and then suddenly I find myself in the last decade or so on about half a dozen committees and boards and advisory councils of academic and arts institutions. And I keep wondering now, is this some sort of a hope and optimism in me that these institutions can be resurrected and reclaimed? Is that why I'm voluntarily being part of all this? Or is it because I suddenly see some new possibility in an institutional route to the revival of the arts? Or is it just that I've turned into a square in my old age? I guess the last option is the most plausible. Because someone whom I learned from a distance quite a lot from, one of India's leading outstanding poets, writers, and public critics, who again have been almost forgotten by the nation, if you want to call it that. Harindranath Chattopadhyay, a very, very important name of the 1940s, 50s, even into the 60s, but one of the most outstanding intellectuals of the left movement in India. He used to say jocularly about many things. These are political statements, but he had a way of sugaring them with particular kind of aphoristic sort of form. He was very fond of saying, when the state gets into the arts get interested. And you see that more and more happening, and of course you see that from the beginning of the building of the modern Indian state. We ascribe it to 1947, the moment of independence. independence, but I think we need to go a little further back and look at the institutions that were built up during the post-British Crown period, post-1857-1860, and the 100 years of that institution building, of which we have inherited or we have just re-modified or adapted and so on and so forth from which. So beginning from 1861, Archaeological Survey of India, and then the Anthropological Survey of India, the People of India project, and so on, this construction of the first act of censorship, official act of censorship, the Dramatic Performances Prevention Act, DPA of 1876. And you can trace many of these. I mean, the very, very important Indian Lunacy Act of 1912. You may wonder what the connection is, but there was a period when many artists used to be very easily sent to jail because their behavior was lunatic. They were doing all kinds of funny things, on the canvas or wherever. And the Lunacy Act was a good instrument when you didn't have anything else to explain or defend. This was a very good kind of law to take recourse to. The Criminal Procedure Code till a few years ago had a fabulous clause, colonial law from 1898 called scoundrel. There's a particular section under which you can be called a scoundrel. The definition of the scoundrel is a cultural definition. A scoundrel is one who sleeps by day and wakes by night. One who rouses about. And no one knows from whither he came and whence he went. And these kind of definitions were, the Indian law was full of this. And they have been applied quite judiciously to many kind of cultural practices. Nomadic art groups, performing troops, even today, when a Tiruputtu troupe in Tamil Nadu, for example, has to travel from one place to the other, and they will travel by bus and carry their harmonium and their equipment. The kind of indignities they're subjected to, it's not a joke. And I remember reading somewhere that right since the first national drama seminar that happened post-independence, when the academies were set up in 1953, Sangeet Natak Academy created a national drama seminar in 1956. It's called the Drama Seminar, and many well-known Indian luminaries of the period in performing arts turned up for it. 88 people participation. Very big names, Anita Cherian, P. Virajamannar, and you name it. One of the things that was picked up there was the need to protect itinerant performers in India, because there's a large number of itinerant performers. Their number runs to millions. The Jatra troops and so on. This was proposed as a bill to be tabled in Parliament and pushed by Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. It was tabled, and there it lies on the table still. It still hasn't been. It's something like the Women's Reservation Bill, for example. It's a lovely, noble thought, and it will go on and on. As Anita Chattopadhyay again used to say, 5-year plans are like a piece of chewing gum. We'll draw it out and draw it out for 50 years to come. So it's something like that. All these bills and things that are there. So this is the context. I'm just rambling a bit here, but this is the context within which my own allergy to the idea of institution, B, the fact that very quickly after independence, the institutions have gone into a state of terminal decline, and this is true in letter after letter, this is true in report after report. I myself have been on 2 committees to relook at the National School of Drama. I've been on some committees to look at the National Museum, and so on. And everywhere the consensus is, we are in a mess. Now, the question is, why should we lament about it? Because we do know, and I'm sure many of you will concur with me, that the arts, in a sense, can also represent a hegemony. The arts can represent an ideology, a dominant ideology. art institutions can be carriers of those dominant ideologies. They can be hegemonic monsters. They can prevent things from happening rather than enable things. And they are like filters, and they are like a gatekeeping function they perform. So what is so wrong if these institutions tumble and collapse? Why should one lament about it? Let them collapse, let them die. After all, there is a certain beneficiary law of opposites. A very good friend of mine, the wonderful scientist and science educator, mathematician, Professor C.V. Sheshadri, who is the Dean of the Indian Institute of Kanpur, while discussing once the decline of technical education in India, he used to guffaw and say that shut down your IITs for 10 years. Just shut them all down. The quality of engineering will automatically rise in the country. So, I quite believe that's a possibility. Then there's a very good friend, Professor Harish Lalwani, an architect who lives in New York, married to this wonderful dancer Uttara Shakurlava. Harish teaches in the Pratt Institute in New York. It's a premier architectural training school. And I happened to meet him 3 days after the Twin Towers in New York were brought down. And his house is just a few streets away from where this whole thing happened. And of course the whole of America was agog, and New York was even more agog. But Harish seemed particularly unfazed by this. And I said, "No, what is this? You're not looking, this just happened in your neighborhood." So he laughed and he said, in our foundation course in Pratt Institute, entry-level students are given an exercise every year. The exercise is, please choose the 2 ugliest buildings in New York. Think of how to demolish them and what else you will create in that place. That's your exercise for the first 3 months. He said, you can't imagine the number of times in the last 20 years I've seen the Twin Towers go down. And so the need for that kind of destruction is I think, a useful thing. And I don't think it's particularly outrageous to think of shutting down all our hemorrhaging art institutions which are bleeding the country, which are simply not responding to any sort of real need on the ground for arts practice. But per se, it's not a bad idea to see them reduced to dust, as if they're not reducing all people. These are representatives of the consolidation of a certain kind of hegemonic system, often standing for all that is narrow, rigid, limiting in arts practice. And governmentalization carries on the task of a specific form of cultural politics. And let's not be innocent about that. That this is not benevolence of the state. And this is what was projected when in Maulana Azad's famous speech in 1953. He was the creator of all these institutions. He didn't probably deliberately say it, but there was a certain sense of top-down, patronizing attitude to the need to set up cultural institutions, arts institutions, so that we can protect and nurture our art forms. So the form of protection is what becomes then problematic. How do you protect? By having a file for every art form, by having a file for every performance form. Every language genre you have a file, and what is in the file is all that matters. Outside the file, things don't exist. I remember this amazing moment, 1993, the time about which Anita was talking, when I was editing these arts pages in the Economic Times. We got this message from America that Professor A.K. Ramanujan had passed away. Bad shock, because just 2 months before that, he had been in Delhi for a seminar at Indian International Center, and he was interacting with a large number of school children and college children. A lovely sight to see him there. And then we hear the news that he's no more. It just so happened that when he was here, another very good friend of mine in the media, Aisha Kagal, wonderful writer, had interviewed him, had a long interview with Professor Ramanujan. And another very, very important Indian photographer, Anita Cherian, had taken some brilliant portraits. And both of them had come and given the material to me, saying the papers that we work for won't be able to carry such long stuff, so you keep it. Whenever you can use it, you use it. So then I called out my team and I said, now this is the time, let's carry a good tribute to Ramanujan. And we laid out the page, we created the design, photographs were well placed. All I needed was some biographical details, which I had with me at home. I was living in Basant Kunj, those days it meant going from, what is it called, ITO junction to Basant Kunj, 1 hour up and 1 hour down. So let me take the shortcut, let me go to Sahitya Academy and probably the awardee of Sahitya Academy. They'll have the material. So I called the librarian, I knew him by name. He was also from Karnataka, Mr. Bangari. So I said, well, can I request you for this material? He could almost feel him standing up at the table and saying, thank you very much for calling. You are the first media person who's called. This is a great loss to the nation. He was my personal friend. He went on like that. Come immediately, I'll give you the material. So I reached the office 5 minutes away. He was waiting at the door to receive me. He let me sit down on his own chair. And he walks 10 feet, pulls out the filing cabinet, big pink file with a big felt pen, A.K. Ramanujan written on it. And then, very ceremoniously, he offers me the file. I open the file, there is not a scrap of paper in it. A.K. Ramanujan didn't exist there. Equally ceremoniously, I close the file, give it back to him, thank you, Mr. Bangari. Tomorrow morning, when my page is printed and when it appears, I'll come and give it to you. Please start a fucking fire up. What does this one say to this kind of thing? But this is the sort of context within which a cultural politics is engaged in. You promote certain things, you don't promote certain things, and you keep a certain kind of a frame within which inclusion-exclusion becomes the game that is played. Because conceptually, institutions represent the one-time interpretation of policy. Once you have the imagination, I mean, India doesn't have a culture policy, India doesn't have a policy on the arts, but India has a culture policy, and India has a policy on the arts, precisely because of the game that is played. Last year we did it, so we'll continue to do it this year. Last year we did not do it, so we will not do it this year also, etc., etc. It's a sense of continuity they maintain, the famous continuity that Rizzo was talking about, but there's a certain issue here that continuity means to come with confrontation. There has to be a struggle to change every time, renew, move track, and take the debate to areas where the debate has not gone earlier. And I mean, after all, as Theodore Adorno has said, there's no culture without administration. Culture is another form of administration, or administration is another name for culture. And admin is nothing but the long arm of the state regulating the natural spontaneity of people. And this regulation is where issues develop. And also then this exercise, while uneven in different locations, is riddled with terminological difficulties and awkwardness. You have now a set of files. There is a file called classical, there is a file called folk, there is a file called tribal, there is a file called creative, a file called contemporary, there is a file called experimentation, a file called modern, and there you are. And this can't be that. The gone painter cannot, for heaven's sake, be modern. He's gone, he's tribal. Adi Vasi hai, that's it. You can't expect anything more from that. But if I, the modern painter, go and work with the gone painter, then there's so much more kudos to me, because I'm working with tradition. I managed to leap out of my boundary. So this is a, I'm not trying to sound cynical here, but there's a very, very deep political issue that needs to be challenged and has not been sufficiently challenged, either by art practitioners, really speaking, or by commentators on the arts. So institutional policy thus emerges as a mode or strategy for the consolidation of the state. And this doesn't need to be emphasized too much when it's self-evident that that is how It's through institutional policy that the state functions. It contributes to the expansion of the state's regulative engines. At the same time, it stands for an abdication of forward-looking perspectives in favor of looking backward at the past, at nostalgia, at the dubious idea of tradition. And this is, of course, very, very much more active in the sphere of performing arts in India, in dance and music particularly. Luckily, visual arts, theatre, to some extent, have all managed to take a leap out of this. There's been a struggle within it. The performing arts, particularly dance and music, have been resistant to this. They have held on to this idea of tradition as their anchor, as their only security blanket, as the only area in which they are relevant. And they don't see relevance in a more modern space. So that's an issue that, really speaking, the academies or institutions haven't gone near at all. So now this helps the arts institutions in forging an idea of unity. I mean, ultimately, this is what the policy drives towards: unity in diversity. That's the one cultural slogan, policy slogan that derived from the setting up of the academies. But the idea of unity gets reduced to one idea, meaning one nation, one language, one culture. So, unity in diversity is fine, but diversity in unity, no, that we are not able to figure out yet. So, as long as you are Hindi speaking, as long as you are belonging to a majority culture, let's say upper caste, upper class, and so on, as long as you wave a patriotic flag, everything is kosher. But the moment you try to move out of that, the moment you make a little protest, the moment you express your own self, you will be pushed in a strange way. So we of course have this a story I love to keep repeating in my classrooms about our great theatre exponent from Manipur, Kanhaiya Lal, Isnam Kanhaiya Lal, who joined the National School of Drama in 1966 at the height of the NSD, when they had already done Tughlaq and they had done Ashwalke, then all the NSD was on a high at the moment. Here comes this young man from Manipur. He was already slightly older than the other students. He was already, I think, 24, 25. And within day 2 of the term starting, he knew that he was all at sea. Everything was happening in Hindi. And our man knew only his Meitei language. So he tried to say things, and he was heckled, and he was made fun of. And it was a huge student body. There were hardly 24 students in it. And this made him unhappy. He felt homesick. So he went out, and he didn't know whether he should come, whether he'll be accepted. The third day, instead of asking any further questions, he just went and got himself drunk, came back to class, jumped up on the desk a bit just to express his unhappiness. After all, he's a theatre performer. Exactly 3 weeks he lasted in National School. For the first and last time, a student was rusticated from the National School. That's Sadanand Menon. And this word rusticate is such a colonial term, and you don't hear it anymore, but he was sent out of the school, and that is the greatest gift the NSD has given Indian theatre. Because he went back, and he worked in Meitei language, and here presto, within 1 year, he had produced Pebet. And Pebet is what? Pebet is now the textbook play in NSD. First year students are all taught Pebet. This wonderful play without words. So all ha pe pe to Pebet birds singing, and then foxes going Jhum kaka, Shamu kaka, Lili kaka, and all that. And the clash of languages and the clash of cultures, and it's like a pain to a anti-neo-colonial manifesto, somewhat in the manner of a Frantz Fanon. But this is the pain that some of our institutions can create with this idea of monolithic culture. So academies thus become single transcendent institutional bodies for art in the nation, which is what often leads to the institutional failure to honestly reconstruct the past. And this, I think, is one of the crucial issues today vis-a-vis art institutions. How do you reconstruct your immediate past? Do we know anything about our last 100 years? We have a few scholars here, a good friend sitting there at the back, who has done some fantastic work with the museums. How the museums came about, how they were set up, what the history of the museums is. And there is therefore an institutional record to follow and trace. What else have you worked on? What do we know about, or say something like the Kirana Gharana? You were talking about the Gangubai Handel? Kirana Gharana. In front of our eyes, in a period of 82 years, a Gharana rises, reaches a peak, becomes internationally famous, and the sun sets on it, and we don't know anything about the Gharana anymore. We don't know what the teaching methodology was. We have recordings, of course. We have Gangubai Handel recorded, we have Bhimsen Joshi, and so on. Harendranath Chattopadhyay was talking about, he's from Kirana Gharana. He could sing like Bhimsen Joshi, even if it sounds like blasphemy. But he deliberately chose not to. He said, I will not. This art is meant for a time when we become a different nation, when we become a nation of human beings. Until then, let me not waste my art on this. Let me bring my talent to an idea of protest. So he put all his talent in that. He could sing brilliantly protest songs. But once in a while, when he did break into the Kirana style, it was something else. So we know that, Hirabai Barodekar and all that we know. And we have recordings. But do we know how they were taught? Do you know what Sawai Gandhar was doing? Do you know what Abdul Karim Khan was doing? What was it, for example, Abdul Karim Khan's Pancham or the Nishad? How did he perfect the Nishad? You don't have a school here that tells you that. You don't have an academy here that tells you that. You don't have scholarship here that tells you that. So, we need to reconstruct some of this past today, honestly, without that silly national moisture in the eye, that silly patriotic gurgle in the throat. I think we need to look at hard, honest reappraisal of where and what we are. What was that moment in 1929 when an entire form called Sadiratam and Dasiyatam, the Devadasi form, got erased virtually, and a new form called Bharatanatyam got created. It's not a 5,000-year-old dance, for heaven's sake. It's a new modern form. Why do we reproduce this hypocrisy day after day? And in every dance school, in every dance, there are no longer gurus with it. They like to call themselves gurus and acharyas and this and that. But steeped in hypocritical history. So what is it that was lost? Do we have a way of finding out what happened in that moment, 1929? It's not all that far back. It's less than 100 years old. 1929. A dance form was set aside called Chichi, very bad, prostitute dance. And another dance was constructed called Bhakti, venerable, devotional, bowdlerized, cleaned up, presented before a new urban audience, lapped up, and then upper caste girls beginning to learn it, and hey presto, you have it up. New, cultured, independent Indian citizen. But what was lost? Do we know? How will we know? We have photographs of Devadasis. Where are the visual, motion picture records of Devadasis? Do we have any? Has anybody searched for it? It's quite extraordinary. This material is lying in Jacob's Pillow in Massachusetts. Jacob's Pillow is a dance institution, recorded by the man who founded it. Ted Shawn, one of America's leading male dancers, who and his wife Ruth St. Dennis, when they traveled in India, he was having a hand-cranked camera. He documented every single form from Hong Kong, via Cambodia, via Burma, via Agartala, via what is now Bangladesh, to Kolkata, to Visakhapatnam, to Chennai, Madurai, Trivandrum. He's documented the whole thing. We went up to Bombay, Cuttack, also Lucknow, went to Srinagar. Everything is recorded. Where is the recording? It's there. Why is it there? Why don't we have it? Because like the curator in the library there, nobody's asked for it. We are not interested. As a nation, as a set of institutions that we have built, we are not interested in that past. And when you look at that material, you realize what was lost. The new reconstructed Bharatanatyam is a above the torso dance. Focus being face, pretty face. As the critics love to say, sorry, Lila. Large liquid eyes and supple limbs and all this sort of thing. You had a bewitching smile. What was the dance? But when you see that material, you realize, hey man, there's a whole universe below the waist. They were actually using it. These were the dancers. And now, if this history has to be made available, who will make it available? Can we put that onus on dancers, individual practicing artists? I don't think so. Can we put the onus on dance teachers? I don't think so. We need to have a reference material made available by institutions that are created. I mean, that's where the taxpayers' money should go, and that's where one needs to, really focus on and put your energies to recovering that past in a more dynamic way. You can't imagine what it will do to Indian dance if, in different cities in India, present young dancers see this material. You're going to change their perception of what you can do with your body and the possible for work. So, the point is, the academies and the art institutions have been used for the purposes of a certain kind of instrumentalization, and that's a very, very charged area, because instrumentalization can create all sorts of reroutings, where a natural impulse is traveling that way. You can create institutional blocks and reroute it somewhere else, so that the mind doesn't go there, the scholarship doesn't go there, and so on and so forth. So right from the beginning, there is a constitutional mandate. In 1950, India gave itself a constitution. We call ourselves a constitutional republic. All wonderful, all very virtuous. And the constitutional mandate insists that culture is an integral part of life as determining everything and should be promoted. There's one masterpiece of a sentence in the constitution that promote culture. And it was that constitutional mandate that gets translated in 53 as a set of institutions. But the confusion is evident right from the beginning, that institutions are fine. There's a frequent recategorization of the Department of Culture. Not just recategorization, but also relocation. From the very beginning. First it was with the Ministry of Education. And we had a decade where we kept saying the Ministry of Education gets 0.3% of the national budget. 68% going to defense and armaments. 0.3% going to education. From that 0.3, 0.1% comes to culture. This was the lament at one point. Then it got attached to scientific research. That's wonderful. Science and culture coming together, science and arts coming to the grid. But they didn't stick with it for too long. They immediately shifted it to human resource development. And then into the beginning of this century, it became attached to tourism. And it's only in UPA2 that has become an autonomous, full-fledged ministry 2009. Until then, it was all Department of Culture under various other ministries. And what can be a greater joy than the fact that the first Minister for Culture in India was none other than Manmohan Singh. It didn't last long, he gave it away to somebody, but there was that moment of Camelot when possibilities were there. The Prime Minister is the Minister for Culture. Anyway, vintage Harinna Chattopadhyay aphorism I quoted earlier neatly encapsulates the silent void that many arts institutions under the umbrella of the Ministry of Culture have been coming to. The larger question now is how our state-funded institutions need to be managed and administered. Should these institutions be headed by artists? Now, there's a big debate going on. Since I'm also from within, meaning I participate in some of the internal meetings of these organizations. This is a big issue that comes up. Should the institutions be headed by artists who are generally perceived as temperamental and anarchical? Which, I rest the case. Or should it be run by bureaucrats or by a trained cadre of arts administrators? There's a new category that's now slowly being pushed. Even if there is a larger faith today in the idea of an artist as a professional without a profession, there is certainly a case to be made out for a specialized cadre that might be better equipped to deal with the complex pressures of sustaining our arts institutions. Globally, the evolved practice over the past several decades is to prefer professional curators, scholars, and historians who are both authorities and authors in their respective fields over professional artists and practitioners who head museums, colleges, biennales, arts festivals, and so on. So artists are left alone to do their work, and this meta-artistic sphere is handled to a new set of professionals who have grown. The Indian case is peculiar because we inherited a set of institutions from our national movement, which enshrined the idea of artistic renaissance as integral to the idea of freedom. And that was quite wonderful. All that was what was happening in the 1910s and 20s, in fact a little earlier, with E.B. Havel, for example, persuading Sadanand Tagore to come with the idea of the Bengal school and so on. Rabindranath Tagore, Mahakavi Vallatol, Rukmini Devi Arundel, and Uday Shankar were thus among the first few who built iconic institutions that amplified the idea of freedom to also include the freedom of imagination. It is more than ironic that post-independence, each of these spaces, Uday Shankar's Almoda school of course perished earlier, well, not perished, he just shut it down because he didn't see it going anywhere, and instead he made a film, fantastic film called Kalpana. But the other spaces, Shantiniketan, Kalakshetra and Kalamandalam, have become central or state-administered departments, answering to the demands of being deemed universities under University Grants Commission. And you can't imagine the torture and trauma of that. An artist who's just about turning a mature artist, a musician who's just getting into that space called the space of liminality and understanding, suddenly looks around and says, hey, I'm 60, I have to retire. And that's a UGC rule, and so on. So the possibility of benefiting a future generation of students through experience, through their skill and talent, that suddenly vanishes before you. One of the first things the state does when it invades the arts is to self-consciously erase the idea of conflict in creative expression. Now this is something that I'm sure those who are here have thought about, that art is not simply someone's expression of genius. It's not a lightning bolt from the blue that comes and it's what we like to think about Coleridge. He had a dream, he woke up, he wrote up the dream, hey presto, it was a great poem. But there's a process in that, and the process is a process of conflict, of tension, of trying to engage with life around. And it's not always hunky-dory. It's not as if the creative process is something that's very happy and you always have a smile on your face and you paint and you sing. This whole romantic thing that's been created about art is I think, a bit of a populist kind of myth. Artist goes through agonies, and in fact, more agonies than probably a normal human being goes through, because that's where the well springs of creation come from. So when the state gets into it, what it does is it assumes the task of valorizing all expression routed through it as a legitimate validation of its homogenizing ideologies, which paper over all differences and neutralize all dissent. Everything becomes in support of the state. You cannot exist outside of it. And if you exist outside of it, then you need to find very, very special strategies to do it, as many Indian artists have done. They have not necessarily kept quiet in this kind of thing. They have found their own avenues by which to create that new space, that very, very necessary new space where you can breathe free and not carry always the nation on your shoulder and the holding of flag aloft. You think free. Now, to consistently achieve this, the state needs to set up institutions that work and intervene in this field. It needs to strategize its institutions and make them appear as if they represent all artists. As I know, I'm in the Lalit Kala Academy. Lalit Kala Academy constantly claims we represent all artists of India. But these artists comprise about 300 people, 3,000 people across the country, and many of them are self-appointed artists, meaning they're probably not an exhibition for 20 years. They've probably not put anything on canvas or done any sculpture for a long time. But they find some value in being in a circle which celebrates art. And thereby they build these kind of constituencies. And we have a Lalit Kala Academy is a very, very strange constitution which, in the name of democracy, creates a peculiar electoral constituency. In fact, last time, about 6 years ago, the elections were so bitter and so terribly rigged and so terribly corrupt that they had to recruit the help of the election commission to run the election for the Lalit Kala Academy. 3,000 people. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And the election commission don't call us again, we've had enough. So the procedure for dealing with finances or executing projects are deliberately designed to produce a paralyzing effect on these bodies. This again, when you go close to if you want a scholarship, if you want a project to be funded, the kind of extraordinary hurdles you have to jump over, like a steeplechase race. It's a very, very special, gift of the Indian state to Indian artists. Last year we celebrated the 105th anniversary of Havel, mentioning E.B. Havel, who was the inspirational force behind the emergence of the idea of the Bengal school. Now, Havel's ghost continues to haunt us because we still have not dealt with the problematic he posed in a very, very perceptive essay in 1912, exactly almost 100 years ago. It's called The Basis for Artistic and Industrial Revival in India. Reading it, you feel that time has stood still and that the roulette has brought us back to the very spot we started out from. The issues he raised were not simply for the revival of Indian arts and its pedagogy. He was batting for what he conceptualized as a national genius, whose primary condition was the unquestionable need and necessity to be free. Only a free Indian could be able to produce free art. And in his mind, this was non-negotiable. And we still don't have a manifesto of that kind coming from an artist or a group of artists or a community of artists in the Indian context. Right? And the 1956 drama seminar I was mentioning, one of the papers presented was by the great actor Balraj Sahni. And Balraj Sahni's opening paragraph says, and it's an address to this very, very distinguished theatre people across different parts of the country. Balraj Sahni was not representing the IPDA, the Indian People's Theatre Association. The IPDA was deliberately not invited to this because it was seen as a leftist protest theatre. But Balraj Sahni nevertheless was there in his own capacity as an actor. And he said, there cannot be growth for theatre in this country as long as we live in a realm of fear. We are now an independent nation, but we are still living in a realm of fear because you're still carrying on the statute that 1876 Dramatic Performances Act in the statute book, under which any performer, any playwright can be arrested and thrown in jail for anything that sounds like dissent. Or permission can simply be negated for that performance. It's just lucky that today 14 states in India have removed it. Only 14 out of 29, 14 states have taken it out. We still have some states where it's very, very difficult to have free performances, free of fear, free of the kind of possibility of being blocked and so on and so forth. So we look around today and can reflect on the growing unfreedom within which much of our art practices flourish. It's like the mad cow disease. Institutions of arts across the country under the Ministry of Culture are choking and asphyxiating on themselves. It is a palpable self-destruct. Just look at the crumbling plaster and clutter and the debris falling around us. During the first meeting of the Central Advisory Board for Culture, now UPA1 in 2008 constituted a Central Advisory Board for Culture whose mandate was to meet every 3 months and look at the state of cultural practice in India, cultural institutions in India, and what needs to be done, and so on. At that time, Ambika Soni was the minister. Since that date, 2008 it met first. Since that date it has met in all these years 2 more times. Amazing regularity. But Ambika Soni herself revealed that there were over 1,500 vacancies in the Indian museums under the Ministry of Culture. Mainly due to the dearth of qualified candidates. Now this is fantastic. The city of Delhi says, we are going to acquire 200 brand new buses for the city. And then you say, but hey, we don't have drivers because we forgot to have a driver's training school. So the buses get parked somewhere. It's exactly what's happening in the Ministry of Culture, and particularly in the museum sector, where since our universities don't have particularly hot departments in museology, in curatorship, in archaeology, and so on and so forth, history particularly, the museums are really choking for lack of personnel. National Museum here, I mean, there's a fashion to say the National Museum is the second most important building in India. First, of course, is the Parliament, the temple of democracy. The next biggest and most important institution is the National Museum, because that tells you who you are, what your identity is, where you came from, what your past is, and etc. etc. It's kind of a repository of that kind of fantasy almost. But number 1 to number 6, not there. Just 3 months ago, they appointed a certain gentleman as Director General of the Museum, IAS officer. Previous posting, Secretary Tourism, Kerala. He's now Director General National Museum. I mean, is that all you need to be Director General National Museum? But this is happening after 17 years, but they couldn't find even that. The top post vacant. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 6 vacant. 70 odd museums under the Ministry of Culture across India. Cumulatively, still about 1,480 posts are vacant. So we don't have personnel here. So it's a very, very interesting, inward eating system where as you progress, you will have every institution going through this sense of collapse. It was in the public news recently, the peculiar battle that happened with the National School of Drama. And the previous director, a very, very well-known theatre person, retired, and a new person had to be appointed. The kind of political pulls and pressures, the kind of manipulation that goes on, and the inability of a search committee to find 12 people. They look around the country, they travel around. A, there's not enough trained people who can do both, meaning administration and creative. B, those who can do it say, no, sorry, you don't want. You're very happy outside. So, yeah, so the one reason why we lack qualified administrators for the arts is the lack of courses that impart training in the art management and arts management. There seems to be no guidelines or policy pertaining to pedagogy, selection, documentation, archiving, purchase, dissemination, and so on. This has already created insurmountable holes in the administration of our art institutions. We could certainly do with a range of postgraduate courses in the history of performing and fine arts, archaeology, museology, arts curation, management, and as such. There is no doubt the country will be needing hundreds of arts administrators in the immediate future, and a special cadre, probably like a central cultural service or a central fine arts service, etc., along the lines of central services might not be available. The arts, however, are no longer little cubby-hole practices, satisfied with existing on doors as they were probably 60 years ago. The Indian antiquities sector, at a conservative estimate today, is worth 100,000 crores of rupees. The modern Indian art market is touted at over 25,000 crores of rupees. The Indian performing arts, the recordings and the festival sector is easily over 10,000 crores of rupees. The publishing industry too is well above 10,000 crores. All these sectors are now well on their way to organizing their own destinies, bypassing the state academies and bureaucracies and the corrosive smell of self-important patronage. So, seems like it's a new bloom, you don't need the government. Interestingly, for the last 10 years, virtually every single Secretary of Culture has been saying, don't come to us, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the money, go to the private sector. But they have been pushing the arts very deliberately in a, regulating it and pushing it in a particular way, so that this issue does not become like a public thing where the government has to take a policy on this. This is called gentle, soft persuasion. You just move. But the danger here now is the incursion of the market as a regulatory agent. It's no longer the state that will be regulatory, but the market that will be regulatory. For the past few years, a very pernicious idea called the creative and cultural industries has been trying to tantalize the state agencies to provide it with both regulatory and administrative muscle. The Planning Commission is being pushed, the Parliament is being lobbied. It is virtually a strategy to push arts, including crafts and traditional textiles, into a no-holds-barred private domain by withdrawing all state subsidies and protections. And this is a kind of a Ramayana that you can tell for 40 nights and this will go on. But this is a point when I think, just to conclude, I can return to the question I posed in my opening. The reason why I am agreeing to sit on some of these committees and advisories in these moribund institutions, because I see this almost as having become a primary democratic act of dissent. How to save these institutions? I wouldn't have thought of it. 15 years ago, somebody had told me, this is what you're going to be doing after a few years, trying to sit in these kind of committees and trying to fight those battles. In fact, if they had told me you're going to be defending the Indian Constitution, I would have said no. I don't care about the Indian Constitution. I'd much rather throw it. It's a bourgeois constitution. What do you do with it? But today I say, my God, I need that constitution badly. My God, I need these institutions badly. These are the bulwarks against a marauding market that has come now, that is going to roughshod over anything that we have seen till now. The bungling of the government institutions is bad, is pathetic. But the rapaciousness of the market is something that none of us is going to be able to handle. So, I think I'll just stop at that. Basically, just to conclude by saying, quoting my favorite philosopher, Walter Benjamin, whose words are imprinted like hot lead in the mind. that the attempt must be made in every epoch to wrest the arts away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. In our times, I think we need to wrest the arts away from the enervating touch of officialese on the one hand and the manipulative mechanisms of the market on the other. How we will do it? We have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you for that really interesting talk. I've taken tons of notes, and I'm still trying to process spaces of intervention. But there are a couple of questions that I have been preoccupied with recently. If not preoccupied, they've come to mind, and your talk has touched upon them. One is the relationship that you have brought out between the way in which creation of the act of artistic creation happens, and the relationship between the act of artistic creation and the institution. And you're pointing to a particular problematic, and that problematic is an institution is basically a site of conformism that reproduces a kind of conformism. So where does one have, where is the space for contestation in this kind of framework? One would also then think about how does one conceptualize the avant-garde in this context? I also wanted you to kind of talk about the way in which you began with the way in which the Adivasi or Adivasi art is represented, or is fixed rather, not represented, it's fixed, like an insect is fixed on a board. How does this relate to the ways in which policy making for tribal land properties, the tribal community itself, how is it related? I think there is a relationship that should be thought about. I will also like to open the talk up for comment and discussion.
I guess there are no specifically easy solutions except the solution of confrontation, the relation between artistic creation and institutions. It had a particular nuance 50-60 years ago because the idea of patronage still seemed to continue. It's a feudal notion. It's part of the old court culture in the subcontinent. And under feudalism, the fact that if you're going to be a full-time artist, then somebody needs to support you, somebody needs to feed you. Even if it meant just enough to survive and get by. And artistic guilds and individual artists and craftspeople and those who were creators, they survived on this. Some a little more than the other, depending on the kind of patronage, but essentially this was the system that then got replicated and carried over into post-independence India, where the institutions began to play the same role of Mai-Bap, of being providers, of being alls, and of being aesthetes. I mean, this is where when a Wajid Ali Shah does something because he's an aesthete, you know that he's an aesthete. But a secretary culture need not be an aesthete. He just comes from somewhere and goes somewhere else. But they pretend that they're aesthetes. And when this pretension begins, that's where the institutions begin to get locked up into peculiar paradigms. So one person, one administrator comes who likes the Kumari form. So everything else is kept aside just to promote Kumari. Another person comes who likes only Kathak dance, so only promote Kathak and keep aside everything else. And so on, this whole thing. But even then there is a method in the madness, meaning we agree that we believe in only the classical. The classical is what is national and what is Indian. Whatever is outside of that is problematic. So if you call something modern, then wait a minute, I'm not going to look at it. Call something contemporary, then well, that is a charged area, one is not sure where one is going. And so on. So there is a sense of unsurety, there is a sense of fear also, and there is a sense of, therefore, not what I'd like to call exclusion. You just exclude it. One wouldn't want to be as severe as saying it's a caste system, but then it's something akin to that, because patronage ultimately relates to that. And it's very individualistic, and there's no reason given, and you don't know why these things are happening. There is, in the history of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, that is a organization for promoting the culture and arts under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There has been no history of a modern Indian performer being sent abroad. It's the job of this ICCR to take Indian art abroad or bring outside artists into India. The last 48 years, 50 years of its existence, they have not sent one contemporary dancer or musician abroad on their funds. They have invited many from abroad. They have collaborated with embassies and consulates who are bringing artists from abroad. But when anything is sent out of India, it is only classical material. Because that has got ambassadorial value. That is what tells you what your nation is, what a glorious past we had, no matter how critical the history is, and so on. So, you won't find a single note anywhere which says do this. There is no evidence that this is a policy, but in practice this becomes policy. Since the previous director did it, I continue to do it. Since I have been doing it, the next one. Nobody even tries to take a step outside it because you don't explain why you do it. And nobody wants to bell the cat there. So, you will reproduce conformism, and what is it to do? These institutions are not prepared yet to take a challenge. Nobody has said, now let me turn this thing upside down a bit. I remember when in the late 80s, early 90s, one of the chairpersons of Sangeet Natak Academy was one of our great modern playwrights of India, Girish Karnad. Modern person, very erudite, well-read, etc., etc. At the valedictory function of this annual festival that happens in Chennai, led by the Music Academy of Chennai, which is like a pillar of that society, Carnatic music and all that, he chose to say that Bharatanatyam was a reinvention of the 1930s, and that modern day Bharatanatyam is a conservative form compared to what was being practiced by the Devadasis. You can't imagine the kind of brickbats he received for that. Within 48 hours, he was recanting his statement. He was apologizing profusely in public, saying, sorry, I didn't mean to say all this. I have been misunderstood and misinterpreted and so on. He couldn't say it. And this is a problem with a certain kind of possessiveness of material that constitutes a cultural block. And how you will engage with it, you can only engage with it by encountering it head on. Some artists have done it. In the dance world, for example, Chandralekha tried to do that, and she met with resistance, but nevertheless she went on. Was kept away as far as possible from official situations, but didn't matter to her, she went on. And a certain body of reference material is now there to look at. It looks very tame today when you look at what she did, in the 1980s and 90s. You may say, but is that all that she did? But at that time, you can't imagine the kind of waves it created. Today it looks like, everybody space opened out. So that will be the role of the artist. How do you open out space constantly? That can be only done through a personal engagement with the institutions, against institutions, and almost on a daily dialogue with these institutions. So for me then, conceptualizing the avant-garde is easy in our context, even though avant-garde is not a term I would like to use. But it would be an artistic community that is willing to take risks. Otherwise it's a very comfortable world. If I toe the line, you can't imagine the comfort I'll get. I'll get awards, I'll get this, I'll get that, I'll get government housing, all sorts of accolades. But you won't mind being a little uncomfortable. Then take the risk. That's only way. And about the tribal thing, I don't think I'll go into it now because it will really take me in a very big. It's an area which I've been looking at for quite some time, and it's a huge issue, and it's invisible here. And in our kind of context, just because there's a Ministry for Tribal Affairs, we say our tribal circumstance, okay, because ministry is there. But it's a very, very major issue, and it's a very sensitive and painful issue. And I think probably LILA can perform a particular task by bringing in more people who will speak on that with some more depth and with more time and so on.
Okay, the paper is open to discussion.
I just wanted to ask, you've been talking about the relation between the arts institutions and the state, but if you link arts, the creative arts and the intellectual arts, if I may call them, to activism, then I wonder a lot of times the arts are living in ivory towers and just claiming to, or perhaps not even claiming to have a link with any kind of activism, or how do you see that situation in India at all?
Well, yes and no. There is an ivory tower art, and there is a on-the-ground art, and both are happening. And what one is talking about is the tension between the two. And it needs to get a little more healthier. I think you can see in the Indian context that certain artistic material is beginning to hurt some people. There was a period when we were worried about state censorship. The state, like for example, the dramatic performance art, state censorship regulating a certain kind of expression. Today, that has been almost supplanted with street censorship. The kind of torture that these young people, 8 people in the Kabir Kala Manch are going through in Maharashtra, in Pune particularly, the kind of attack the Shiv Sena makes on them. They're all Dalit singers and performers, but since they speak for Dalit dignity and they speak, they enact some of the writings of Jyotiba Phule and so on and so forth, they are publicly attacked. Now, how many of us, for example, goes in support of them? Do we have the courage to say, no, this cannot happen, we will go and come and stand with you, we will give you a protective cordon? We are not able to do it. And this is just one incident. I mean, you take the story of M.F. Hussain, you take the story of the kind of attacks they had to go through, and eventually get isolated. So, for the protesting artist, this is what seems to be the current destiny, a certain kind of isolation. Very, very few institutions that would back you and support you. Luckily, you have a Sahmat in Delhi, and there are a few other such voices here and there, but it's so scattered and so few that it's not enough. The density is not enough. But the struggle is on, so don't mistake.
What I meant is, even if you are a protesting artist, do you really have that kind of an impact, and do you have that kind of viewership or readership? And I don't know if it actually
It won't be the same. It won't be the same. If you're a protesting artist, you are very different from an Amitabh Bachchan or a Shah Rukh Khan. You're different. You're a different being altogether.
Other questions?
One question regarding these, what happened to Kerala Kalamandalam in last year? as a society, Kerala has failed in stopping the conversion of Kerala to a university. Now, what is happening? The institution is not getting a proper person to become the principal. They all have to retire at 60 years. And this was not the way was run. But my question is, okay, now they won't get a PhD person to teach. Particularly, there are problems of recruiting people. But as a society, how and why Kerala has failed with all these, we have been discussing all these issues, cultural issues and all, but somehow as a society, Kerala also has failed in doing something concrete to, I would say, to save the institution, but to stop what happened to Kerala.
Yeah, it's the same thing that's happening to, like I said, Kalakshetra or Shantiniketan. It's the same, almost the same paradigm where there is a vision, there's a core vision which they hold on to. But the core vision was for something that was almost 100 years ago. At the moment of time, the core vision has somehow remained static and it's not moving. So, Kalamandalam has become this almost like a museum of a particular kind of an art form that doesn't seem to resonate today. So it's meant for a particular kind of a connoisseur, it's meant for a particular kind of a rasika, whose population is getting less and less. You don't know your text, you don't know the language, you don't know the nuances. You're not grown up. I mean, there was during the time when Kathakali sort of became efflorescent, the time also when people had lots of, because you could sit through the night and watch a performance. You would be a repeat audience 40 continuous days and so on. Today, it's that same thing about TV attention span. Your eyeballs are flickering and the excitement is not happening. So I just come and see the artists I love. Kalamandalam Gopi is performing, I go to see that, but even that is coming down. So this whole decline of a particular kind of viewership is going to affect the art form. And it's going to affect its training institutions. So for me, the issue is still this with Kalamandalam and Kalakshetra and Shantiniketan. They're Shantiniketan a little better, but they did not set up research academies within their institutions. There is no mind of the life of the mind in these institutions. It's great to say that a great artist is also a great mind, but that's not sufficient. You need to exercise a certain kind of intellectual reflection on your own history, your own past, your own location in that particular art. And particularly for students, I think it's very, very important. There was a time when you learned a dance form, what the guru said was good enough, God's own word. And you didn't ask beyond that. If the guru said, put your hand like that, you put your hand like that. You didn't ask the question, why, what does it mean? You probably learned it 20 years later after certain practice, oh, this is what the guru meant. But there was no explanation for it. There was a particular method of learning. But today, I think in today's world, that could change. There has to be a self-reflexivity, there has to be processes by which you can absorb new thought, new academic practices, new intellectual disciplines, which can only lift your art to a different plane. It can't destroy your art, it only make it much better. But the resistance of these institutions to creating that space is, I think, one of its dooms. So again, like I'm saying, it's imploding inwards, just self-discipline. I cannot hold a national seminar in India on Kathakali today. I cannot hold it without inviting Philip Zarili. The expertise has gone to America or to UK. It's not here. I can't do a dance seminar on Bharatanatyam in India today without inviting 6 scholars from Canada, UK and US. They are the ones who are telling us what our form is and what our history is and, there are 3 levels. There's one fellow who works in Montreal who knows Telugu, Tamil and Kannada. And he's writing book after book, and we have no answer to it. Many, I don't mean to say we need to answer it, but we are not able to produce a scholar like that. And they get their grants, and they get their tenure, and they get their position, they get a department. We don't have it. We don't have a department. But the JNU, with great difficulty, has had now one professor appointed for dance after 112 years. We couldn't find a professor for dance.
Am I audible?
Of course you are. Please. Very good.
Am I more audible? So there is a particular point that I wanted to pick on amongst many others actually. First of all, the idea of a national seminar on Kathakali itself it sounded slightly funny to me, and by that I don't see why what mental Kerala in the margins. But I agree with you on the fact that museums are in decay. But most of the museums that we talk about that are under control are actually colonial museums. And I don't think I would shy away from saying that a lot of them are in fact extremely offensive in their narratives. So if you were to, even the idea of museum itself, how would you deal with that? And to what audience are you playing with? And if you maybe come to some kind of situation where you find that there is a necessity to demolish these or recreate these and the kind of expense you may incur in this process, when this is an institution that does not exactly nourish the arts but actually frames the arts, how are you going to deal with this? I mean, these conflicts sort of flare to my head. I wonder.
Yeah, you're absolutely valid, and I'm glad you even asked the question, because it leads you once again to square one, meaning where do you begin with? So it is true that post-independence we have created very few museums, and those that we created were in fact celebratory museums of some Maharaja or something. They have literally no relevance to contemporary Indian history. We don't have a museum for partition, for example. What's the problem? So it's said there's a problem of honesty. Why can't you engage with partition through creating a memorial where you are able to look at yourself and your past, immediate past, in a more critical way? For example, the Johannesburg Museum for Apartheid. It puts you through the ringer. You go inside and you had it, meaning it will ask you all the toughest possible questions. And that's a meaningful museum. It's not some place to go and gush. But we're not been able to do that. So we have inherited a set of buildings and a set of material. National Museum Delhi has 200,000 pieces, which we say are our pieces, our history. Maurya, Gupta, you name it. What do you want to do with it? You want to throw it out lock, stock and barrel? Go ahead. You have a huge Indian Ocean. But if you want to keep it, then kindly be serious about it. How will you do it? Shouldn't there be a method? Shouldn't there be a method of indexing, codifying, presenting, labeling, lighting? I mean, you name it. Every possible modern instrument needs to come into it. It can't be a casual affair. It can't be like a Navaratri Guru. So, you get what I mean. And that's where the predicament begins. So you're convinced that you need that. They are colonial museums, you're convinced that you want to that's a lineage, that is a continuity, you want to continue with it. But we are not even rethinking of representing. We're continuing exactly the same thing that was done pre-independence. And currently, so this is the peculiar state, currently the National Museum, which has 17 galleries, very important galleries. Out of the 17 galleries, 7 galleries have been shut down for the last 4 years because there is no curator for it. Now, if that is not a national crisis, it's another kind of a national crisis. So it technically shut down in that sense, 50% is gone. Are we bothered about it? No, we are not bothered. So what? Museum band hai to kya? So this is the attitude. Whereas if a gallery is shut for 2 days, there should be a national uproar. Why is that music? I want to see the Chola bronze section. There should be a pain in your heart that you want to see it. It's not there, then that's, you can imagine that's a national character. And convert this into not national museum, but national go down. And keep it all nice lock and scene and nobody will steal it. And let it not go into the international, what do you call, antiquities market and so on. But if you want to run it, you have to run it in a purposeful way, as if it's a contemporary thing, as if you engage with it on a daily basis, as if it renews you as a citizen every time you encounter it. If that participation is not there, then it's kind of a cosmetic exercise. So, as far as the national seminar on Kathakali goes, I will have a, different point of view. I think in the present context, everything is national, whether you do it in, what you were saying in the beginning, translocal, whether you do it in Kumbakonam or whether you do it in Chunabhatti or whether you do it at Jodhpur, it's a national thing. It's no longer some little thing somewhere, because to put it on the net, it in fact becomes a global thing. But what I'm trying to say is the absence of local scholarship.
And one thing you should know, Sadanand, the experiment that is tried out by LILA Foundation in Galakshetra, where she used to send these students in 3 batches to various places. And they went around these little temple towns and things like that. She said, I don't want you to usually see the temple and come back and see the statues and say we have this pose in Bharatanatyam or something. I want you to go into the deep history of these places and what actually happened here. And the students did some extraordinary things, because they contacted a whole lot of very old families connected with the temple in different ways, which the people didn't even know about. And they got a lot of material out of them. And this was really to make them understand something and to do real research instead of always sitting down there and doing the usual Karakshetra training. But there was so much resistance to it from certain quarters that they felt that she was going away from, this was taking the students away from what Rukmini Devi had taught. And I think after she has left the institution, the entire project has more or less been given up.
So that's the peculiar situation, that even a conservative act becomes a progressive act. A field trip of dance students to various sites from where they can learn about dance becomes a threat. And it's that closely that we guard this history, this fake history. So maybe that history should go into the museum and other things should come out.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
So I have an educational background in science and engineering, so I perhaps do not understand the nuances or subtleties of artistic expression in various art forms. However, this was quite an enlightening and revealing interaction that I had, and the example that you cited, especially related to the rise of Bharatanatyam and how the Devdasi form of dance eventually kind of died. I mean, my question is basically related to the current globalized economy, and in this current globalized economic context, how does artists, what I think, this is my personal opinion, that any artist need viewership or audience to sustain. So how do artists from any sort of art form, how do they sustain themselves without the market today in the current globalized economy? I mean, I cannot understand. I do not have a background in art, so perhaps I cannot connect the dots here. So if you can.
But what do you mean by without the market? The market's very much there. They are all in the market.
No, I mean.
So it's a very flourishing market. Like I said, it's about 25,000 crores of rupees. It's a huge market.
No, sir, you actually mentioned, from what I could gather from your review, said that the market and the state both have a sort of a debilitating effect on artistic expression and the way artists perform and the way artists work these days. So what is the solution so that of the issues that you raised, and is there a way that the debilitating effect of the market, as you said, the marauding effect of the market, it can be if not completely eliminated, at least mitigated or reduced to a certain extent?
But that will have to depend on the, how do you say, good sense of the practitioners themselves. And the only example I can give is of 1992-93, when there was a major crash in the American economy. And as you know, America is one of the great collecting nations. They collect art, and so every corporate house, for example, has an art advisor, an art consultant, and normally the vice president's job, vice president of the company, whose job it is to assign a task to an art consultant to purchase art annually. They'll have a budget, say $2 million to buy art. Based on the advice that they receive, they purchase the art and they put it on their walls and they have periodic exhibitions. It's seen as a participation in the life of the nation. It's also connected with certain tax benefits you get. In the American system, you spend, I think, 3.5%, 2.5% of your corporate profits in art, you get a tax benefit on that. So it's a nice synergy there. But when this happened in 92-93, when the market crashed, the board members of the corporate houses got very agitated. Board members, meaning those who are shareholders, they got very agitated that how can you make a loss? You are such a big company, Rockefellers, and such a big company. How do you make this kind of losses? Show us your books. And in the books, it says that something like, say $800 million is locked up in works of art that have been purchased over the years. The shareholders were aghast. They said, "What? No, you are saying your company is crashing, but here is $800 sitting in your corridors. Dump it. We don't mind if you get only $300 or $300 million in return. Dump it. We want that money in the thing so that the company runs and we get our share benefit." In a space of, according to New York Times analysis, in a space of 11 months, the works of over 200 major artists, American artists, was literally dumped in the market. They became like, no, but the market value crashed. If I am selling my work at, say, 100 rupees today, and I sell it to you, and you sell it to the next person at 2 rupees, then I become valueless. But the next person will say, what the hell, what you're selling for 2 rupees. So that's what happened to the artists. Suddenly, their market just completely collapsed. At that time, people who stepped forward to rescue the artists, so that also happened, the public participation. Communities, like in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, communities came forward and said, look, we have a space here, we have a school, and attached to the school is a small hall. That hall will give you for displaying your work if you want, provided you come and teach art in our schools. And for the first time after many years, American artists realized the value of that kind of giving back to community. And not just being money minded and profit minded and how many millions and how many zeros. So that was a hard lesson, but they learned it. Today that continues. They have not gone back to the market with the same enthusiasm. India, we are still discovering the market, and there is a exuberance, there is a excitement, and there is this whole intoxication of new money that is coming into the arts. The bubble needs to burst before they will find a real connect with the real society. Otherwise, like she said, it becomes an ivory tower exercise. It doesn't go beyond a particular kind of a bubble existence. The bubble needs to burst.
Towards the end, you mentioned this whole idea of someone who's the administrator or the manager. So towards the end, you mentioned this idea of a person who really, understands the creative side and also understands the bureaucratic and administrative side of things. And this idea of the manager, which I think is absolutely sort of invisible in India right now. And I do feel again, because you mentioned that is something that could fill the gap between this whole idea. But so in education and everything else, there's this whole idea of NGOs that is come up. You also talked about CSR right now, so which is also coming to this whole, it's become from a policy, way it has come into policy to say that there's 2% of profits from corporates, which needs to go into, let's say, social benefits and humanitarian ones. But where do you think, is it possible for the arts to come into that kind of sector, which is taking from the market, but it's taking in a way where the administrator is responsible for the quality of how you tap that market, but at the same time, we're not saying that the state takes away from its responsibility. It has to have that. Like, let's say Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, 50 NGOs, 1,000 NGOs in India put together cannot reduce 300,000 rupees to put into education. So the state has its responsibility, it needs to stay. But how does one tap the market and also keep the responsibility of the state within this whole bureaucratic process, which we know is not going to change? But where is this administrator who comes in and has that responsibility of putting all of these things together?
What I suggest is you write this up as an article. It's a question that needs to be posed in public. Because when you say, where does it come from? There are no easy answers. One can give one kind of solution, but that need not be the solution. So it needs to be thought about. The problematic as you posed it is a clear problematic. It exists. I would be happy actually with just at the moment just a new debate on this whole thing, new discussion. Besides, one of the other critical things that happened around the mid-1990s was the complete exit of Indian mainstream media from arts writing. As you might have noticed, probably you're too young for it. In the 1990s, every single newspaper had full page for the arts. They had weekend supplements, which are very, very good writers, good editors. There used to be an animal called an arts editor, who doesn't exist in the Indian media today. Space for the arts has gone, but it's come up in the e-space. There are online networks that are emerged. Otherwise, serious art writing has gone into niche areas, niche magazines, small magazines, all that. But the fact that it's vanished from the mainstream space is a crisis in itself, because we are not familiar with any of this. The debate is not happening. I mean, how many of you knew that 1,500 posts are vacant in the Indian museum system? Whereas there should be. I mean, you don't say that 1,500 posts are vacant in the Ambani empire. I mean, it will be like shareholders will burn them alive. So why can't we burn alive people who are responsible for it? It's just not happening. We're not excited. We're not concerned with this particularly. And there's a deliberate exit of debate on this in the public media. So you have to bring in the debate all over again. Only when you bring that, you will get some more, I think, healthy ideas and a more collective form of expression.
Do you feel, is it not the responsibility of the individual artist to sort of maintain whatever you are trying to say, which is a responsibility of the state? For example, you're saying that this particular central state or whatever government institutions are trying to institutionalize what is called art. But I believe that patronage is not just what the government grants are about or what the government can give you, but the patronage lies in the people themselves, unless the people do not appreciate that particular art for its existence. How is that promotion of art or existence of that art even possible? So how is this whole debate going to go forward unless the people are really interested in it, or for that matter, maybe ask about the national seminar? All that has to be relevant only when the people are interested and when there is a debate going on for a long time.
Yeah, good. So basically, why does one need, when I say let us battle to recover some of this space, institutional space from the state, as a space of sanity, a possible space of sanity, not a space of hegemonization, not a space of co-option, not a space of neutralization, but as a possible space for sanity. What one is saying is that you're taking the onus away from the individual artist. An individual can't really battle this. Meaning, if I'm a active artist, I do what I do, and then 10 of you say, hey, that's great work, so I respond to the 10 of you, and then 20 more of you say it's great work, so I respond to you. And I take my art in the direction of the response that is coming. And if it means showing in galleries, then I go and show in galleries. If it means showing it abroad, I take it abroad. If it means participating in certain kind of biennales and triennales, I do it. So I go with that tide. Very seldom do I think of countering it, because it's part and parcel of your roji roti. But if an institution can tell you, hey, that is okay, you do that, but there is also another way of doing it. There's also a more participative way of doing it, not just this buyer-seller relationship. There is something else that is possible, which I believe is the role of state institutions, to twist this around, to counter the malefic effects of the market. Because market you can't control. Market will in fact tell you, my home, the curtains are blue, I want a blue painting. And you will do it also. You're not doing it. So, you need that counter coming from somewhere. Earlier we thought NGO kind of work could do it, or individual voices could do it. But today, it's evident that it needs a more solid backing, and that backing is probably possible if this space can be created. Now, that's not going to be easy, because like I said, the state also resists it. The state sort of doesn't allow those spaces to be hijacked by mavericks or free thinkers or radical people or even bohemians. It doesn't allow it. It's very protective of that space. So one needs to try and do this slowly, but I think this is where it begins. You can't ask the individual artist to resist this type. It will be very difficult for the individual artist. But if there is a platform that offers an alternative, a counter, and I'm sure many artists will respond to that. Currently, the problem really is that these platforms are not visible anymore, these alternate platforms.
Time for 3 questions more, and if there are 3 people, if they could ask these questions together, there's another one today, one after the other. How many people need to ask questions? I know I see one gentleman there, another is you, and anybody else?
Hello.
Yeah, okay, so we have the 3.
I just wanted to make a statement or a question saying that it was a very good, very pertinent and very relevant talk to something which has not been discussed before. And I don't think anyone's looked at the sector in this way before. So all the best to you and people who support your vision and who are looking at the arts in this way. Thank you.
I wanted to, something similar to what the previous person had asked. I think this whole question is also related very much to arts practice and how we practice it today, and how we practice what we do today. Arts practice itself is integral to this question of how we engage with an institution or not, and how we engage with the government or not. And I find that a little absent in the discussion we've been having. Like, how do we practice today? What is our practice even? And if we engage with a form like Kathakali or Bharatanatyam, what is that engagement even? What does it mean to engage with Bharatanatyam, which is claiming to be 5,000 years old but is still only 60 years old? And I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves in trying. Perhaps it's many layered. The complexity of living today in India is really adding to it. But I think arts practice needs to sort of feature in this somehow, because otherwise I don't know how to engage with these institutions, having never been part of them. And how do I access them? And what does it mean for me to access it, even as an artist? I don't want to fall prey to market forces. At the same time, I don't want to be conforming to to a narrative that doesn't speak to me. So where do I belong? I mean, at the end of your talk, I just felt like, yeah, that's, again, I'm doomed. I mean, I don't belong anywhere. I can't do anything. I just have to go ahead and do what I need to do and see where it gets me, which probably is nowhere.
Yeah. I don't think you're doomed. You're just part of a creative confusion. Yeah. It's linked to that.
The other side of that, actually, so you can, this is about, she was talking about the art practice. I'm talking about, we refer to Sammat and the kind of protest spaces that we have in various locations. Recently we had this 25th anniversary of Sammat, and Sammat publicly declared that for 15 years they couldn't go to a place like Bombay because of the kind of political situation there, and nobody was hosting them. There was no place. It's not easy for them to go. So I'm talking about, kind of wondering aloud about the kind of narrative of limitation that these protest spaces create, as part of their content. So how do you, because this narrative of limitation, the moment you say you're a niche audience, this is also related to the kind of audiences that come to these kind of spaces. We've been trying to create a larger constituency with a lot of other people coming into these spaces to discuss this. Like normally when you go into an art-related talk or lecture or anything related to art, then the constituency is kind of predictable. And you know kind of clearly who is coming and who's going, etc., etc. But we have been trying in our own ways to kind of bring different people into these kind of spaces so that it's more democratic and more largely discussed. But the kind of narrative of limitation which is going into the content of the protest spaces, it's a kind of disturbing because it's becoming more and more, strong. So it is actually related in a way to what she was saying.
I find that a really, really interesting question. And it's very clearly articulated a problem that one has felt and thought about, but has not been able to frame. I have always kind of felt that this kind of narrative of limitation comes from perhaps political fealty. Political fealty which defines what can be said. We are always commenting on how the right limits what can be said. I think very often we tend to ignore the way in which the progressive also has its own unwritten codes about what can be said and how it can be said and where it can be said. What I find really disturbing, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, is how the left reacts to feminists. And I think those of us who are from Kerala know this really well. We encounter this over and over again. And the feminist, somebody very close to me keeps telling me that, feminists are just liberal thinkers who are breaking the compact, the solidarity. And I think the only way of dealing with it is, increasingly I feel that the only way of dealing with this problem is our commitment to attention. And by commitment to attention, I mean attention to the work, and also kind of bringing an attitude where we do not presume that this is what a work is going to say. That we actually allow ourselves to listen to the work and don't presume, preempt the argument, the position. And so every work should in effect, or at least that's what I try, every work should in effect be a new work every time you meet it or you encounter it. And I think that should cut across the political spectrum. I think of that as a methodology that would address also the fact that as viewers, as participators, we find ourselves more and more absent from the moment of encounter. And that call to attention is absolutely important. Yesterday I happened to read this article which I found really brilliant. It is about this guy from some southern state in the US who had conducted, a black man, middle-aged black man who had conducted 3,200 executions. And having conducted those 3,200 executions, he talks about how over that period he had begun to feel a greater and greater sense of discomfort, of horror. And what I loved about that article was just the attention he displayed towards the modes of execution. I had never ever encountered that. He talked about how many watts go into an electrocution or whatever it is. What happens to the body when that happens? And I just felt attention. And that attention is a commitment to the person who is dying, to the labor that we are undertaking. And increasingly, I think that kind of reciprocal attention is disappearing. I can't, I'm finding large meta-narratives to explain things more and more difficult to deal with. Politically, ethically, for me it's now about how does one respond to the complexity of the everyday in the present.